The spotlight was his. The world knew his name. But in one moment, a single decision, born of arrogance, would shatter his illusion of control. What he didn't know? The woman he dismissed as irrelevant held the power to take it all away, and she was about to use it. The studio buzzed with activity as models of all shapes, sizes, and backgrounds lined up for their chance to shine under the bright lights. The air felt thick with tension, a mixture of nervous excitement and high-stakes ambition. In the center of the room stood Richard Lanson, the renowned fashion designer whose name was synonymous with success, luxury, and an ego as sharp as his tailoring. Dressed in his signature all-black ensemble, Richard exuded authority, his critical gaze slicing through the crowd like a scalpel. Everyone wanted his approval, but few ever received it. The models walked one by one, each presenting their best runway strut. Richard hardly glanced up from his clipboard, muttering dismissive comments to his assistant, Anna, as if the people in front of him were mannequins instead of individuals. Too short, too plain, too ordinary, he mumbled, his pen scratching through names on the list. His entourage nodded in agreement, careful not to challenge his opinions. Amara stepped forward, the sound of her heels clicking against the polished floor silencing the murmurs in the room. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her posture regal and her gaze steady. Her rich brown skin seemed to glow under the studio lights, and her natural curls framed her face like a crown. A few heads turned, but Richard barely glanced at her. When Anna read her name aloud, Richard's expression soured. He tilted his head slightly, as if sizing her up, and then dismissed her with a flick of his hand. "Not the look we're going for," he said curtly, his tone cold and final. Amara's lips twitched into a small, almost imperceptible smile, not one of amusement, but of understanding. She didn't argue, nor did she falter. She simply nodded and stepped aside, her composed demeanor catching Anna's attention. For a moment, Anna hesitated, as if she wanted to say something, but Richard's sharp glance silenced her before the words could form. As Amara walked away, her confidence remained intact. Unlike the others who left dejected, she moved with purpose, her head held high. What no one noticed was the slight glance she exchanged with James, the brand's marketing director, who stood near the back of the room. It was quick and subtle, but enough to leave questions hanging in the air. Richard, oblivious to this silent exchange, continued with his rejections. The models moved in and out like a revolving door, but something about Amara's presence lingered in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. The moment passed, and Richard returned to his clipboard, unaware that he had just dismissed the very woman who held the future of his brand in her hands. The first ripple of a storm had just been set in motion. After the casting wrapped up, Richard retreated to his private office, a sleek and modern space adorned with awards, framed magazine covers, and sketches of his most iconic designs. The walls practically screamed success, but to Richard they were reminders of a standard he could never let slip. He dropped into his leather chair, flipping through the finalized list of models his assistant had compiled. His brow furrowed as he slashed through names with his pen, grumbling about how uninspired the selections were. Anna hovered near the door, hesitant to interrupt. She held a tablet in her hands, ready to discuss the upcoming runway event. "Richard," she began cautiously, "we're finalizing the roster for the fashion show next week. James mentioned we might want to revisit some of today's choices to reflect a more diverse look." Richard looked up sharply, his lips pressing into a thin line. "James needs to stay in his lane," he snapped. "We're not here to follow trends or check boxes, Anna. Our brand has a legacy to uphold." Anna nodded quickly, biting her tongue. She had learned long ago that challenging Richard was futile. He was brilliant, yes, but his stubbornness bordered on arrogance. "Of course, Richard," she said, her tone carefully neutral. Just as she turned to leave, James appeared in the doorway. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to Richard's high-strung energy. "Got a moment?" James asked, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. Richard groaned but gestured for him to speak. "If this is about the models, James, I already made my decision. I don't need another lecture on inclusivity." James chuckled softly, his hands tucked into his pockets. "It's not a lecture," he said smoothly. "It's a suggestion. That woman you dismissed earlier, Amara, she has something special. I think we should reconsider." Richard leaned back in his chair, exhaling loudly. "Special? Sure. She'll be special for another brand, not ours. She doesn't fit the aesthetic." James's smile didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "You might want to dig a little deeper before writing her off so quickly," he said, his voice carrying a hint of something cryptic. "Amara's not just another face. She's connected." Richard's brow furrowed at the word. "Connected? To who? Another agency?" James shrugged, a sly grin playing at his lips. "Let's just say she's more involved in the industry than you realize. Keep an eye out, Richard. She might surprise you." Before Richard could respond, James turned and walked out, leaving his words hanging in the air like a riddle. Anna glanced at Richard, as if hoping for some acknowledgement of what James had said, but Richard waved her off. "Forget it," he muttered. "We have bigger things to worry about." Still, as the room fell silent, James's words lingered in Richard's mind, sowing the first seeds of doubt. Somewhere deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had overlooked something or someone important. Later that evening, as the casting studio emptied out and the buzz of the day settled into silence, Amara lingered near the building's entrance. The polished glass doors reflected the dimming city lights, casting a warm glow on her composed features. She leaned against the wall, scrolling through her phone, her expression calm but purposeful. James exited the building moments later, his footsteps deliberate. He spotted Amara immediately and approached her with a knowing smile. "You were right," he said quietly, his voice carrying a mix of amusement and intrigue. "He dismissed you in record time." Amara let out a soft laugh, slipping her phone into her bag. "I didn't expect anything less. Men like him don't see beyond their own reflection." James raised an eyebrow. "Still, you handled it well. I thought you might say something. Drop a hint, at least." "Why bother?" she replied, her voice steady. "Let him reveal himself. It's better this way. People like Richard show you who they are when they think you're beneath them." James nodded, impressed by her calm resolve. "He's stubborn, I'll give him that. But the runway event is coming up fast. How do you want to play this? Quiet or bold?" Amara's lips curved into a subtle smile. "Quiet, for now. Let him make his plans. I want to see how far his ego takes him. The show will speak for itself." James leaned against the wall beside her, crossing his arms. "You're patient, I'll give you that. But you know Richard. He's not just stubborn, he's proud. When he realizes the truth, it's going to hit him like a freight train." Amara's gaze shifted to the street, where the lights of passing cars blurred into streaks. "Good," she said softly. "It's about time someone shook his world a little." James studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You're not just doing this for yourself, are you?" Her eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "This isn't about me. It's about all the people who've been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced. It's about changing what this industry stands for. And if Richard can't see that, well, he'll learn soon enough. James smiled, quiet respect in his eyes. I don't envy him, that's for sure. Amara pushed herself off the wall, her stance strong and confident. Let him have his runway, she said. When the spotlight finally shifts, he'll realize he's been standing in someone else's shadow all along. With that, she turned and walked away, her silhouette disappearing into the night. James remained behind, watching her leave, a knowing grin tugging at his lips. He couldn't wait to see how the story unfolded. Inside the building, Richard sat in his office, completely unaware of the storm brewing just outside his carefully constructed world. The pieces were already in motion, and the game was just beginning. The following day, Richard arrived at the office with his usual brisk energy, but something felt off. He couldn't quite shake the lingering thoughts from James's cryptic remarks about Amara. It annoyed him, though he didn't admit it even to himself. He pushed the unease aside, immersing himself in the preparations for the upcoming runway show. The stakes were higher than ever. Investors were watching closely, and the success of the event could make or break the future of his brand. Anna entered the office holding a stack of papers and her ever-present tablet. "Richard," she began tentatively, "I've put together a draft of the lineup for the runway show. Take a look and let me know if there's anything you'd like to change." Richard glanced at the list, his pen tapping against the edge of his desk. The names blurred together, none standing out to him. His mind, against his will, drifted back to Amara's poised demeanor during the casting. He shook the thought off quickly, scoffing internally at the idea that she had left any impression at all. "Fine," he muttered, shoving the list back toward Anna. "It'll do. Just make sure everything is perfect. I want this show to silence anyone questioning our relevance." Anna hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the papers. "Richard," she said carefully, "there's been some chatter about how the brand needs to evolve. A few of the investors have mentioned that inclusivity—" Richard's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "I don't care what the investors are chattering about. This brand isn't some charity or political statement. It's about *art*, my art." Anna took a deep breath, choosing her next words cautiously. "Of course, but maybe just consider broadening the perspective. It might strengthen the brand, not dilute it." Richard waved her off, his patience clearly thinning. "Anna, if I needed a lecture, I'd call James." At that moment, as if summoned by the mention of his name, James appeared in the doorway, a casual yet purposeful look on his face. "Good morning," he said smoothly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Richard groaned. "Do you ever knock, James?" "Why knock when the door's always open for my brilliance?" James replied, flashing an infuriatingly calm smile. He placed a folder on Richard's desk. "I thought you might want to see this." Richard eyed the folder with suspicion before flipping it open. Inside were high-resolution photos of Amara, candid shots from events, editorial spreads, and even a few behind-the-scenes glimpses from other campaigns. Each photo captured her strength, grace, and undeniable presence. "Why are you showing me this?" Richard asked, his tone sharp. James leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk. "Because you're missing something, Richard. This industry isn't just about your vision anymore. It's about influence, about connecting with an audience that's changing faster than you're willing to admit. Amara isn't just a model, she's a statement. She could be the face that redefines this brand." Richard pushed the folder away, his jaw tightening. "I don't need a statement. I need models who fit the aesthetic." James straightened, his expression unreadable. "Suit yourself," he said lightly, "but don't say I didn't warn you." As James left the room, Anna lingered for a moment, her eyes darting nervously between Richard and the photos on the desk. "She really does have something," Anna said softly, almost to herself. Richard didn't reply, but his gaze drifted back to the photos after she left. He closed the folder quickly, as if shutting out the thought, and turned his attention back to his sketches. But deep down, the first crack in his certainty had appeared. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and it was growing. The days leading up to the runway show were a whirlwind of activity. Richard buried himself in the details, from approving fabric samples to overseeing last-minute fittings. He had no time for distractions, yet the conversation about Amara continued to gnaw at the back of his mind. Her name had come up more than once, mostly from James, whose cryptic remarks seemed designed to provoke him. Richard dismissed the thoughts again and again, but the nagging feeling refused to leave. Meanwhile, in a corner office with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, Amara sat across from James in a private meeting. The room, with its sleek furniture and understated elegance, felt far removed from the chaos of the fashion world outside. Amara's demeanor was calm, her hands folded neatly on the polished table in front of her, but her eyes betrayed a quiet determination. James leaned back in his chair, a cup of coffee in hand. "He's stubborn, I'll give him that," he said, shaking his head with a wry smile. "But the runway show is the perfect stage. Once the lights are on and the cameras are rolling, he won't be able to ignore what's happening." Amara tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "The goal isn't to humiliate him, James," she said softly. "It's to open his eyes. He's not the enemy. He's just stuck in his own way of thinking. If he can change, even a little, it'll set a precedent for others like him." James chuckled. "You're more patient than I am. I'd let him crash and burn." She smiled faintly but didn't respond, her thoughts drifting. "What's the status on the lineup?" she asked after a moment. "Has he finalized it?" James nodded. "As of now, your name isn't on it. But don't worry, it will be. I've made sure of that." Amara raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And how did you manage that?" He grinned, tapping the side of his nose. "Let's just say I know how to navigate Richard's blind spots. He thinks he's in complete control, but he's not watching as closely as he believes. Trust me, when you step onto that runway, it's going to be the moment everyone remembers." Amara leaned back, exhaling slowly. "It's not just about the runway," she said quietly. "It's about what comes after. The way he treated me isn't new. It's the same story told 1,000 different ways. If this show does what I hope it will, we'll change the narrative for good." James nodded, his respect for her growing. "You're playing the long game. I like that." Before leaving, Amara glanced out the window, the city sprawling beneath her like a maze of opportunity and challenge. "The runway is just a stage," she said, almost to herself. "The real work begins when the curtains fall." As James escorted her to the elevator, he couldn't help but feel a surge of anticipation. Richard had no idea what was coming, and when the moment finally arrived, the fallout would be as dramatic as the reveal. Amara stepped into the elevator, her confidence unwavering, and disappeared behind the closing doors. Back in his studio, Richard worked late into the night, obsessing over the details of his designs. The sketches were flawless, the fabrics impeccable, but something felt incomplete. Though he couldn't place it, a nagging sense of unease crept into his thoughts, disrupting his focus. He pushed it aside, determined to prove once again why he was the best in the business. Little did he know, the very thing he was ignoring would soon turn his carefully constructed world upside down. The stage was being set, and every decision he made unknowingly brought him closer to the moment he would never forget. The night before the runway show was electric with activity. The venue buzzed with the energy of last-minute adjustments, models practicing their walks, designers making final tweaks to outfits, and stagehands rushing to perfect the lighting and sound. The tension was palpable, but Richard thrived in it. This was his domain, his masterpiece about to unfold. He stood near the stage, watching as models rehearsed their walks under the glow of overhead lights. Each step, each turn had to be perfect. The weight of the show's success pressed heavily on him, and though he projected confidence, the tiny cracks in his composure were beginning to show. His assistants flitted around him, answering his clipped instructions and avoiding his sharp glances when things didn't meet his standards. James appeared from the shadows, his usual calm demeanor intact. He carried a clipboard and moved with an air of quiet authority that often irritated Richard. "Everything looks good from the audience's perspective," James said as he approached, glancing at the models. "But I've got to say, there's still something missing." Richard rolled his eyes, not bothering to hide his irritation. "If you're here to push your agenda about Amara again, save it. The lineup is set, and I don't have time for your games." James smirked, his eyes glinting with something Richard couldn't quite place. "Relax, Richard. I'm just here to make sure the show goes off without a hitch. You're the star, after all." Richard frowned, sensing an edge to James's tone, but too distracted to press further. He turned back to the models, barking orders to one who had stumbled during her walk. "Focus," he snapped. "If you trip tomorrow, you'll ruin the entire look." In another corner of the venue, away from the chaos, Amara stood quietly with Anna, who had taken a rare moment to escape Richard's relentless demands. Anna had been nervous about speaking to Amara directly, but curiosity had finally gotten the better of her. "You're here," Anna said hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you're not in the lineup?" Amara smiled gently, her calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the frenzy around them. "Not officially," she said, "but things have a way of working themselves out." Anna's brow furrowed. "Richard doesn't know, does he?" "No," Amara replied simply, "and that's how it needs to be, for now." Anna hesitated, torn between loyalty to her boss and the growing admiration she felt for Amara. There was something magnetic about her, something that made Anna feel as though she was witnessing the start of something monumental. "You're different," Anna said finally, "not like the others." Amara's smile widened, though her eyes remained serious. "That's the point," she said softly. "But don't worry, by the time the show is over, he'll know exactly who I am." Back on the main floor, the rehearsal wrapped up, and Richard called for the lights to be dimmed. The models filed off the stage, and the room fell into a brief but tense silence. Richard stood alone, staring at the empty runway, envisioning the grandeur of tomorrow's event. The applause, the cameras, the validation, all of it felt just within reach. But even as he stood there, his mind flickered back to Amara for reasons he couldn't explain. There was something about her presence at the casting, her quiet confidence that lingered. He shook his head, dismissing the thought as unimportant. Tomorrow would be his moment, and nothing, no one, could take that away from him. Unbeknownst to Richard, the final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. James exchanged a subtle nod with Amara as they passed each other in the hall, a silent agreement that the next day would bring more than anyone expected. The stage was set, and the audience would soon witness a show that would change everything. The day of the show arrived, and the venue transformed into a dazzling spectacle. Rows of chairs lined the polished runway, with industry elites, investors, and fashion critics filling the seats. A buzz of conversation and the click of photographers' cameras created an intoxicating atmosphere, a perfect storm of anticipation and prestige. For Richard, this was his battlefield, his proving ground. He stood backstage, meticulously overseeing every detail, his nerves masked by his usual air of command. The models, dressed in Richard's designs, waited in perfect formation, their expressions calm but focused. Anna flitted around nervously, checking hems and adjusting accessories, while James leaned casually against a wall, observing the scene with a knowing smile. Amara was nowhere in sight, but James didn't seem concerned. He checked his watch once and then returned his attention to the unfolding chaos. Richard clapped his hands sharply, signaling the start of the show. The lights dimmed and the murmur of the crowd quieted. A single spotlight illuminated the runway as the first model stepped out, the fabric of her gown shimmering with every step. The audience gasped in admiration, and Richard allowed himself a rare smile. This was his moment, his genius on display for the world to see. As the show progressed, each design drew more applause, and Richard's confidence grew. Yet, backstage, there was a ripple of unease. One of the assistants whispered something to Anna, who glanced at James. He gave her a reassuring nod, and she reluctantly returned to her tasks, her face tight with worry. Then came the final segment of the show, the grand finale. Richard's masterpiece, a collection he had poured his soul into, was about to take center stage. The music swelled, the lights shifted, and the models began their final walk. The audience leaned forward, captivated by the intricate designs and bold silhouettes. But just as the last model reached the end of the runway, a new figure emerged from backstage. Amara. The crowd murmured in surprise, and even Richard, standing just off to the side, froze in place. She was dressed in a gown unlike anything the audience had seen, sleek, powerful, and undeniably bold. It wasn't just the design that commanded attention, it was the way she wore it. Every step she took was deliberate, her head held high, her gaze piercing. The lights seemed to follow her as if drawn to her presence. Richard's initial shock turned to confusion, then anger. He turned to Anna, his voice a sharp whisper. "What is she doing out there? She's not on the lineup." Anna opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. James, standing nearby, interjected smoothly, "She's exactly where she needs to be." Richard glared at him, his fists clenching. "What is this? Some kind of stunt?" James shrugged, a faint smile playing at his lips. "You'll see." On the runway, Amara paused at the end, standing before the crowd like she owned the room, which, unbeknownst to Richard, she did. The audience erupted in applause, their admiration for her undeniable. Cameras flashed and whispers rippled through the crowd. Amara turned gracefully, her gown sweeping the floor, and began her return walk with the same effortless confidence. Backstage, Richard's anger simmered as he tried to regain control of the situation. "This is unacceptable," he hissed. "Who authorized this?" But no one answered. The room seemed to hang in a collective silence, as if everyone but him understood what was happening. And as the final applause echoed through the venue, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath him had shifted, though he didn't yet know how or why. The curtain closed on the show, but Richard's world was only beginning to unravel. He turned toward James, his expression a mix of fury and confusion. "Explain," he demanded. James smiled calmly. "Patience, Richard. The best part is still to come." The applause thundered through the venue as the lights dimmed momentarily, signaling the end of the show. Guests began to rise from their seats, chattering excitedly about the final walk. Amara's unexpected appearance was already the highlight of the event, her presence leaving an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed it. Backstage, however, the air was thick with tension as Richard paced furiously, his mind racing to piece together what had just happened. "How did she get on that runway?" he barked, glaring at Anna and the production team. "Who let this happen? I gave strict instructions." Anna fumbled with her words, her face pale under the harsh backstage lighting. Anna fumbled with her words, her face pale under the harsh backstage lighting. I don't know, Richard. It wasn't on the schedule, but..." James, leaning casually against a nearby table, interrupted with a calm chuckle. "Relax, Richard. She wasn't just another model crashing your show." Richard spun around, his eyes narrowing. "Then what was she, James? An uninvited guest? A publicity stunt?" James stepped closer, unbothered by Richard's anger. "Neither. She's exactly what this brand needed. Someone who could breathe life into your designs, make people sit up and pay attention. And judging by the reaction out there, I'd say it worked." Richard clenched his fists, his voice dropping to a cold growl. "You're overstepping, James. I run this brand. I decide who walks that runway." James smirked, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "Do you, though?" Before Richard could respond, the event coordinator appeared at the entrance, calling for his attention. "Mr. Lanson, the press is waiting for you on stage. They're expecting a closing statement." Richard hesitated, his mind still spinning. He shot one last glare at James before straightening his suit and walking briskly toward the stage. The show wasn't over, and he wasn't about to let one unexpected appearance steal his spotlight. Whatever was going on, he would deal with it after the cameras were off. As Richard stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. He forced a smile, masking his frustration as he approached the microphone. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice smooth and controlled. "This show was a celebration of artistry, creativity, and innovation. Our designs represent not just fashion, but a vision that pushes boundaries." The audience listened attentively, their eyes glued to him, but there was a new energy in the room, one Richard couldn't ignore. Whispers rippled through the crowd, subtle but persistent. Cameras panned across the audience, and he caught glimpses of faces turned away from him, focused instead on someone in the front row. Amara. She sat among the elite guests, poised and radiant, as though she belonged there more than anyone else. Her gown, now fully illuminated under the house lights, seemed to carry the weight of authority, its design intricate yet commanding. The whispers grew louder as murmurs of her name spread through the room like wildfire. Richard's composure faltered for a fraction of a second, his words catching in his throat. He quickly recovered, finishing his speech and stepping back from the microphone, but the damage was done. The energy of the room had shifted, and it wasn't focused on him anymore. As he made his way backstage, the murmurs followed him and his frustration boiled over. He cornered James the moment they were out of sight. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice sharp and low. "Why is everyone talking about her?" James tilted his head slightly, his expression calm, but his tone laced with amusement. Because they know something you don't, Richard. And trust me, you're going to want to find out sooner rather than later. Before Richard could press further, Anna approached nervously, holding out a tablet. "Richard," she said quietly, "you might want to see this." He snatched the tablet from her hands, his eyes scanning the screen. It was a news article already live, accompanied by photos from the event. The headline read, "Amara's stunning walk steals the show. Rumored ties to Lanson's brand shake the industry." Richard's heart raced as he read further, the article hinting at connections he didn't yet understand. Amara wasn't just a model. She was someone with influence, someone with power. And judging by the whispers, she was about to make her move. For the first time in his career, Richard felt the ground beneath him shift. He wasn't in control anymore, and he hated it. The spotlight, once his alone, was beginning to move, and it wasn't stopping for him. Richard stormed back to his office, clutching the tablet like it might hold the answers to his spiraling questions. He slammed the door shut behind him, leaving Anna and the rest of the team hovering nervously in the hallway. He couldn't focus, his thoughts racing as he pieced together the events of the night. Amara wasn't just a model, that much was clear. But who was she really? And why did it feel like she held a power he couldn't yet comprehend? As he scrolled through more articles and social media posts, a pattern began to emerge. The whispers about Amara were growing louder, hinting at a connection to the very brand Richard had built from the ground up. Comments poured in online. Who is Amara, and why is she the talk of the show? Her presence overshadowed even Lanson's designs. Rumors suggest she has ties to the brand's ownership. Could this be the start of a new era? Richard's grip tightened on the tablet. Ownership? The very idea was absurd. This was his brand. He had poured his life into it, sacrificed everything to build it into the empire it was today. The thought that someone else could claim a piece of it, especially someone he had dismissed so easily, felt like an insult. Just as his frustration reached a boiling point, there was a knock at the door. Before he could respond, it opened, and James stepped inside, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "Not now, James," Richard snapped, his voice taut with irritation. James closed the door behind him and leaned against it, crossing his arms. "Actually, now is the perfect time," he said evenly. "It's time you learned the truth." Richard glared at him, his patience wearing thin. "If this is another one of your riddles, I'm not in the mood. What's going on?" James didn't flinch under Richard's anger. Instead, he walked over to the desk and placed a single document in front of him. "Read this," he said simply. Richard hesitated, his eyes narrowing, but curiosity won out. He picked up the document, his gaze scanning the page. At first, it didn't make sense. A legal agreement, filled with the kind of dense language that made his head spin. But as he read further, his heart began to pound. The name at the bottom of the page leapt out at him. Amara Bennett. "This can't be right," he muttered, his voice barely audible. This isn't possible." "Oh, it's very possible," James said, his tone almost smug. "Amara isn't just a model, Richard. She's the majority shareholder of the company. She inherited it when your mentor and original investor, Eleanor Bennett, passed away. You remember Eleanor, don't you? The one who believed in you when no one else did?" Richard's face drained of color. Eleanor. The woman who had given him his first big break, who had invested in his talent when he was just another struggling designer. She had always been more than a benefactor. She had been a guiding force, someone he had deeply respected. But her passing had been sudden, and he had never thought to question what might have happened to her shares of the company. James continued, his voice steady but sharp. Eleanor left her shares to Amara, her goddaughter. The papers were finalized months ago. You've been working for her this entire time, Richard. She just chose not to make it public. Until tonight. Richard sank into his chair, his mind reeling. It felt like the room was closing in on him, the weight of the revelation pressing down on his chest. He thought back to Amara at the casting call, the way she had carried herself, her calm confidence even in the face of his dismissal. She had known all along, and she had let him reveal his arrogance for the world to see. "This can't be real," he said again, though his voice lacked conviction. "Why didn't she say anything? Why didn't she stop me?" James raised an eyebrow. "Maybe she wanted you to show your true colors. Or maybe she wanted to see if you were worth keeping around." He leaned in closer, his tone softening slightly. "You've built something incredible, Richard, but you've let your ego get in the way. Amara doesn't want to destroy you. She wants to transform this brand into something bigger than you could ever imagine. The question is, are you going to fight her, or are you going to step up?" Richard didn't respond. He couldn't. His world had shifted in an instant, and for the first time in his career he didn't know what to do next. All he could see was Amara's face as she walked that runway, her presence commanding, her power undeniable. And for the first time he realized he wasn't the one holding the spotlight anymore. Richard remained in his chair, his hands gripping the edges of the desk as if the solidity of the wood could anchor him to reality. James stood silently, watching as the truth sank in. For all his arrogance, Richard Lanson looked smaller now, the weight of his own hubris crashing down on him. "Where is she?" Richard finally asked, his voice low and strained. James tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You want to talk to her now?" "Where is she, James?" Richard snapped, his frustration spilling over. He rose from his chair, his movements abrupt and restless. "She's in the conference room," James replied evenly, "waiting for you." Richard paused, straightening his suit jacket as if preparing for battle. His mind raced with questions, accusations, and defenses, but underneath it all was a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not of Amara herself, but of what her presence meant for his carefully constructed world. He stormed past James without another word, heading straight for the conference room. When he entered, Amara was sitting at the head of the long glass table, her posture relaxed but commanding. She turned slightly as the door opened, her calm gaze meeting his stormy one. She wasn't wearing the gown from the show anymore, but even in a simple, elegant suit, she radiated the same unshakable confidence that had captivated the audience earlier. "Richard," she said smoothly, gesturing to the seat across from her, "I was wondering when you'd come." He didn't sit. Instead, he stood at the end of the table, his hands gripping the back of the chair as he leaned forward. "What game are you playing, Amara?" he demanded. "You've been toying with me, watching, waiting. Why? What do you want?" Amara didn't flinch at his tone. Instead, she rested her hands lightly on the table, her expression thoughtful. "It's not about what I want, Richard. It's about what this brand needs." "This brand doesn't need you," he shot back, his voice rising. "I built it. Every stitch, every design, every accolade, it's my work, my name." She tilted her head, her calm exterior unwavering. "And yet, without Eleanor's investment, none of it would have been possible. You didn't build this brand alone, Richard. You've had help at every turn, whether you acknowledge it or not. Eleanor saw potential in you, but she also saw the future." That's why she trusted me to take this company forward." Richard's grip on the chair tightened, but he said nothing. His jaw clenched as her words struck deeper than he wanted to admit. Amara leaned forward slightly, her voice softening but losing none of its edge. "I gave you a chance, Richard. I wanted to see if you could adapt, if you could lead this brand into a new era. But you've made it clear that you're more interested in clinging to the past than embracing what's possible." His anger flared. "You don't know what it takes to survive in this industry. You've walked one runway. What gives you the right to think you can lead a company like this?" Amara's eyes sharpened, her voice firm. "I know what it means to be underestimated, to be dismissed before I even have a chance to prove myself. And I know that this industry is ready for change, whether you like it or not. This isn't about me, Richard. It's about creating something bigger than you, bigger than me. Something that reflects the world we live in, not the one you've tried to control." The room fell silent, her words hanging heavy in the air. Richard felt the sting of her truth, but his pride wouldn't let him show it. "So what now?" he asked bitterly. "You take over? Push me out?" Amara's expression softened slightly, but her resolve remained clear. "That's up to you. I'm not here to destroy what you've built. I'm here to make it better. But if you can't step aside and let this brand grow, then yes, I'll take the reins. And I'll do it without you." Richard's chest tightened. The thought of losing everything he'd worked for was unbearable, but the realization that he might be the one standing in his own way was even worse. For the first time, he saw himself not as the visionary, but as the obstacle. Amara rose from her chair, smoothing her suit jacket as she walked toward him. She stopped just short of where he stood, her voice calm but unyielding. "The choice is yours, Richard. You can fight me and lose, or you can work with me and create something extraordinary. Think about it." With that, she stepped past him, leaving him alone in the room. The echoes of her heels faded down the hallway, but her words lingered, sinking into his mind like a seed taking root. For the first time, Richard realized he wasn't in control, and perhaps he never had been. Richard stood motionless in the empty conference room, Amara's words echoing in his mind. The silence around him felt deafening, pressing against the walls of his ego. For years, he had believed himself to be untouchable, a genius who answered to no one. Now, the foundation of that belief had been shaken, leaving him with a question he didn't know how to answer. What if she was right? He sank into the chair at the head of the table, the spot Amara had just occupied, and let his head fall into his hands. Memories of his journey flooded back. The grueling nights sketching designs in a cramped studio, the rejection letters, and then the moment Eleanor had stepped into his life. Her belief in him had been the catalyst for everything, her investment, the lifeline that had turned his dreams into reality. He had owed her everything, but he had never considered the possibility that her legacy might include someone else, and that someone else was Amara. Richard reached for the document James had shown him earlier, his hands trembling slightly as he read through it again. The proof was irrefutable. Amara was the majority shareholder, holding more power over the brand than he ever had. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. The irony was cruel. The very person he had dismissed so easily at the casting call now held the keys to everything he had built. Yet, beneath the sting of humiliation was a flicker of something unfamiliar. Doubt. He had always believed his vision was the only one that mattered, but the reactions from the show told a different story. Amara's presence had ignited something in the audience that his designs alone hadn't achieved in years. The press, the investors, even the models, they were all captivated by her, not just for her beauty, but for what she represented. Diversity, change, a new era. Richard hated to admit it, but the brand had grown stagnant. Sales had plateaued, and the criticisms of his narrow vision had become louder. He had dismissed those voices, convincing himself that his artistry was beyond reproach. Now, for the first time, he wondered if he had been wrong. The door creaked open, pulling him from his thoughts. Anna stepped inside, hesitating when she saw the weight of his expression. "Richard," she said softly, her voice tentative, "are you okay?" He didn't respond immediately, staring at the document on the table. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but strained. "Did you know?" Anna's eyes widened. "About Amara? Not until recently. James told me, but I didn't know how to bring it up." Richard let out a bitter chuckle. "Of course he did. James always knows more than he lets on." Anna approached cautiously, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Richard, I think this could be good for the brand. For you." He looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Good for me?" "She just walked into my world and turned it upside down. She's taken everything." "She hasn't taken anything," Anna said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "She's offering you a chance to adapt, to grow. You've always been brilliant, Richard, but you can't do this alone anymore. The industry is changing, and Amara understands that in a way you've been too proud to see." Her words stung, but there was no malice in them, only truth. Richard slumped back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "What if I can't?" he murmured. "What if I don't know how to change?" Anna smiled gently, pulling up a chair across from him. "Then let her help you. You don't have to lose everything, Richard. You just have to learn to share it." The room fell silent again, but this time it felt different. Less oppressive, more reflective. Richard looked at the document one more time, then closed it and pushed it aside. His hands rested on the table, his fingers tapping idly as he stared into the distance. "I need time to think," he said finally, his voice low but steady. Anna nodded, standing and giving him a reassuring smile. "Take the time you need, but don't wait too long. She's not going to stand still." As she left the room, Richard was left alone with his thoughts once more. The weight of the decision ahead of him felt heavier than anything he had faced before. But somewhere, deep beneath the layers of pride and fear, a small part of him wondered if Amara's vision could be the spark that saved not just the brand, but himself. The next morning, Richard arrived at the office earlier than usual. The building was quiet, the hum of the city outside muffled by the thick glass windows. He carried a weight in his chest that felt heavier than any pressure he'd faced in his career. The sleepless night had been filled with memories of his rise to fame and the people who had helped him along the way. Eleanor, most of all. Her belief in him had been unshakable. But what would she think of him now? He entered the conference room where Amara had confronted him the night before. She was already there, sitting at the same head seat as before. This time she wasn't alone. James was beside her, leaning back in his chair with his usual composed expression. Anna stood near the corner of the room, clutching her tablet nervously. A few other senior staff members were seated as well, their faces a mixture of curiosity and unease. Richard paused for a moment in the doorway, scanning the room. It was clear Amara had summoned this meeting, and everyone knew it. He straightened his posture, steeling himself, and walked in with purposeful strides. Without a word, he took the seat directly across from her. Amara greeted him with a calm, polite nod. "Good morning, Richard." "Amara," he replied curtly, his tone betraying none of the turmoil inside him. James glanced between them, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Well, now that everyone's here, I think we can begin." Amara leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. Her voice was steady, but her words carried weight. "Richard, I wanted to call this meeting to lay everything out in the open. The runway show was just the beginning. The response from the press, the investors, and even our audience has been overwhelming. They're excited about the direction this brand is heading, about what it could become." Richard held her gaze, his face unreadable. "And what exactly do you think this brand should become?" Amara didn't flinch. "Something bigger than one person's vision. Something that represents innovation, inclusivity, and adaptability. The world is changing, Richard, and fashion needs to change with it. People want to see themselves in the designs we create. They want to feel represented. That's the future." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, but Richard ignored it, focusing only on her. "And where does that leave me?" he asked, his voice edged with bitterness. "On the sidelines while you take over?" Amara's expression softened, and for the first time there was a flicker of empathy in her eyes. "That's not what I want," she said sincerely. "You're a brilliant designer, Richard. Your work is the foundation of this brand. That shouldn't change. But the way we lead, the way we create, has to evolve. I'm not here to push you out. I'm here to offer you a partnership." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone. Even James, who had clearly anticipated this moment, seemed to sit up straighter, watching Richard closely. Richard let out a soft, disbelieving laugh. "A partnership? You've spent weeks watching me, letting me humiliate myself, and now you're offering me a partnership?" Amara met his skepticism head on. "I wanted to see how you'd respond to being challenged. You're used to being in control, but leadership isn't about control. It's about collaboration. And whether you realize it or not, we can do more together than we ever could apart." Her words struck a nerve, but they also planted a seed. Richard's mind raced as he weighed her offer, the fear of losing everything battling with the realization that she might be right. The brand was at a crossroads, and so was he. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice measured but laced with vulnerability. "And if I say no?" Amara's gaze didn't waver. "Then I'll move forward without you. I don't want to, but I will if that's what it takes to ensure this brand thrives. The choice is yours, Richard." The room waited, the tension thick enough to cut. Richard leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the armrests as he stared at the woman across from him. For the first time, he saw not a rival, but an equal, someone who could see the future in ways he never had. Finally, he nodded, the weight in his chest lifting just slightly. "Fine. Let's see what this partnership looks like." A ripple of relief swept through the room, and Amara offered him a small, genuine smile. "You won't regret this," she said softly. For the first time in a long while, Richard wasn't so sure. But as the meeting moved forward, outlining the next steps for the brand, he felt something he hadn't expected: hope. The days following the meeting marked a dramatic shift in the company's energy. Richard and Amara began working together, though their partnership was anything but seamless at first. Richard struggled to relinquish control, his instinct to micromanage clashing with Amara's forward-thinking ideas. Their creative differences often led to tense discussions, with sparks of conflict flaring as they worked to find common ground. Despite the friction, there was an undeniable synergy in their collaboration. Amara brought a fresh perspective that challenged Richard's traditional approach, while Richard's expertise and attention to detail grounded Amara's ambitious vision. Slowly but surely, they began to understand the value in each other's strengths. One morning, Richard found himself staring at the sketches scattered across his desk. They were his designs, but something about them felt stale, uninspired. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, when a knock sounded at his door. Amara stepped inside, carrying a folder under her arm. She didn't wait for an invitation. She never did. But he didn't mind as much as he once might have. "I have something to show you," she said, setting the folder on his desk. Richard raised an eyebrow but opened it without protest. Inside were mood boards, color swatches, and concept sketches that combined elements of his signature style with bold, modern influences. The designs were vibrant and dynamic, blending his craftsmanship with a sense of inclusivity and cultural celebration. "These are yours?" he asked, glancing up at her. "They're ours," Amara corrected, her voice steady. "I took your sketches and reimagined them. This is what I see for the future of the brand, a collaboration between your legacy and what's possible when we broaden our horizons." Richard studied the designs, his initial skepticism giving way to intrigue. They were unlike anything he'd created before, yet they felt like a natural evolution of his work. "It's different," he admitted, his tone softer than she'd expected. "That's the point," Amara said with a small smile. "It's time to be different." Their first true test as partners came in the form of a special project, a capsule collection designed to showcase the new direction of the brand. The concept was ambitious, blending influences from diverse cultures and perspectives while staying true to the elegance that had defined Richard's designs. The collection was to be unveiled at a high-profile industry event, with both Richard and Amara sharing the spotlight. The process of creating the collection was intense, with long nights spent in the design studio and countless revisions as they pushed each other to think bigger and better. For Richard, it was a humbling experience. He had always prided himself on his independence, but now he saw the value in collaboration, not just with Amara, but with the entire team. One evening, as they worked late in the studio, Amara paused to study a gown draped on a mannequin. "Eleanor used to talk about you all the time," she said suddenly, her voice quiet. Richard looked up from his sketches, surprised by the mention of his mentor. "She did?" Amara nodded, her expression thoughtful. "She believed in you. She said you had a gift, but more than that, she said you had the potential to change the way people saw fashion. She wanted this brand to be about more than clothes. She wanted it to mean something." Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. He had always known Eleanor's faith in him was profound, but hearing it from Amara added a new layer of meaning. "I didn't realize how much she saw in me," he admitted. "She saw a lot in you," Amara said with a smile. "And she saw a lot in me, too. That's why we're here, to make her vision a reality." As the deadline for the capsule collection approached, Richard found himself leaning into the partnership more than he thought possible. He began to trust Amara's instincts, recognizing that her ideas didn't undermine his. They elevated them. In turn, Amara learned to respect Richard's meticulous attention to detail, which gave their designs a level of refinement that set them apart. The day before the unveiling, Richard stood in the studio, surrounded by the completed pieces. The collection was breathtaking, a perfect harmony of their visions. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Pride, not just in his work, but in the team that had brought it to life. When Amara walked in, he turned to her with a small, genuine smile. "You were right," he said simply. She raised an eyebrow, teasing. "About what?" "About everything," he replied. "This is what the brand needed. This is what I needed." Amara's smile widened, and for the first time there was no tension between them, only a shared sense of accomplishment. The future of the brand no longer felt uncertain. It felt limitless. The night of the unveiling arrived, and the venue was alive with energy. The event was held in a grand, open-air space, with a sleek runway cutting through an audience of industry elites, influencers, investors, and media personalities. The stage was set, both literally and figuratively, for a moment that would redefine the future of the brand, and, in many ways, the fashion world itself. Backstage, the models were a picture of poise and anticipation, each dressed in the pieces from the capsule collection. The diversity of faces, body types, and styles on display was striking, a bold statement of inclusivity and innovation. Amara moved through the room, offering quiet words of encouragement to the models and ensuring every detail was perfect. Richard, for once, wasn't barking orders. Instead, he stood beside her, observing the preparations with a newfound sense of calm. "You nervous?" Amara asked, glancing at him as she adjusted the hem of a gown. Richard exhaled slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "More than I've been in years," he admitted. "But it's a good kind of nervous." Amara smiled, nodding toward the runway. "They're going to love it." The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd. The music began, a vibrant, eclectic mix that reflected the spirit of the collection, and the first model stepped onto the runway. The audience leaned forward, captivated. Each piece told a story, blending Richard's signature elegance with bold, contemporary influences. Rich fabrics and intricate details met vibrant colors and unexpected cuts, creating a collection that felt timeless yet fresh. As the models walked, whispers of admiration rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed, and journalists scribbled notes furiously, already preparing their headlines. The applause grew louder with each look, culminating in a standing ovation as the final model completed her walk. Richard and Amara stepped onto the runway together for the closing bow, a moment neither had imagined when they first met. The crowd erupted in cheers, the ovation lasting long enough to bring a rare flush of color to Richard's face. For once, he didn't mind sharing the spotlight. Standing beside him, Amara felt a swell of pride, not just for the collection, but for what it represented. This was more than fashion. It was a statement, a vision for what the industry could be when collaboration, inclusivity, and innovation were at the forefront. After the show, the pair were inundated with praise. Investors spoke of renewed confidence in the brand. Critics called it Richard's greatest work yet, and guests clamored to meet Amara, eager to understand the woman who had brought such a bold new energy to the company. Later that night, as the venue emptied and the chaos subsided, Richard and Amara found themselves alone on the runway. The room was quiet now, the echoes of applause lingering like distant memory. Richard looked around, his expression thoughtful. "I was wrong about you," he said finally, breaking the silence. Amara turned to him, her eyes warm but unwavering. "I wasn't here to prove you wrong, Richard. I was here to show you what's possible." He smiled faintly, nodding. "And you did. Tonight, this wouldn't have happened without you." "It wouldn't have happened without us," she corrected, her voice gentle but firm. For the first time, Richard didn't feel the need to argue. Instead, he extended a hand. To a new chapter? Amara shook it, her grip strong and confident. To a new chapter. As they walked off the runway together, the future felt brighter than ever. The brand was no longer a reflection of one man's vision, but a collaboration of ideas, values, and voices. It was a rebirth, one that promised not only success, but significance. And for the first time, Richard Lanson felt truly proud, not just of what he had built, but of what it was becoming. The weeks following the unveiling were a whirlwind of success. The capsule collection became an instant sensation, selling out within hours of its release and earning rave reviews from critics and consumers alike. The industry buzzed with excitement, heralding the collection as a groundbreaking shift in the fashion world. Articles and interviews praised the bold partnership between Richard and Amara, calling it a masterclass in blending tradition with innovation. Richard, once reluctant to share the stage, found himself embracing the collaboration. He was no longer just the face of the brand. He was part of a dynamic team, working alongside Amara to build something greater than either of them had imagined. Meetings with investors became less about defending the past and more about presenting a shared vision for the future. The tension that had once defined their dynamic gave way to a mutual respect, even friendship. In the office, the atmosphere transformed as well. The staff, inspired by the success of the collection, began working with a renewed sense of purpose. Diversity wasn't just a buzzword anymore. It was woven into every decision, from the models they cast to the campaigns they launched. Amara's influence extended far beyond the designs. She became a mentor to many, encouraging new ideas and voices to take the spotlight. One day, as Richard walked through the design studio, he noticed Amara sitting with a group of junior designers, discussing sketches spread out across the table. She was listening intently, her presence calm but commanding, as the young creatives explained their ideas. He paused, watching from a distance, and felt a rare sense of pride, not just in her, but in what the brand had become under her leadership. Later that afternoon, Richard called Amara into his office. The room, once a fortress of his ego, now felt more collaborative, the sketches and notes on the walls reflecting both of their visions. She entered, her usual confidence tempered with curiosity. "What's on your mind?" she asked, taking a seat across from him. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking about Eleanor," he began, his voice quieter than usual. "About what she would think of all this." Amara tilted her head, her expression softening. "She'd be proud," she said simply, "of you, of the brand, of everything we've built together. This is what she wanted, a legacy that evolves." He nodded, his eyes distant. "She always said that fashion isn't just about clothes. It's about telling stories, about giving people a way to express themselves." He looked at her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I think we're finally doing that." Amara smiled back, her voice steady. "We are. And it's only the beginning." Richard opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a small framed photo of himself and Eleanor, taken during the early days of the brand. He set it on the desk between them, the weight of the past mingling with the promise of the future. "Let's make sure it stays that way," he said. Amara reached across the desk and shook his hand, sealing the promise. "Together," she replied. As they left the office that evening, the city lights sparkled outside, a reflection of the possibilities ahead. The brand was no longer Richard's alone, nor was it just Amara's vision. It had become something bigger, something that honored its past while boldly stepping into the future. And for the first time, Richard didn't feel threatened by change. Instead, he welcomed it. Months passed, and the transformation of the brand continued to ripple across the industry. The buzz surrounding the capsule collection turned into sustained momentum as Richard and Amara unveiled a full seasonal line. The collection, titled Legacy Reimagined, was an homage to the past while embracing the future, blending Richard's signature craftsmanship with Amara's innovative vision. The launch event for the new line was even grander than the capsule unveiling. Held in an expansive venue that combined modern architecture with historic touches, the setting symbolized the very ethos of the brand, a fusion of tradition and progress. The runway was lined with guests representing every corner of the fashion world, from established icons to emerging voices. There was an air of expectation, as though everyone knew they were witnessing something historic. As the show began, Richard stood backstage, watching the models take their first steps onto the runway. The designs were bold, yet timeless, each piece telling a story of collaboration and reinvention. The diversity on the runway was unparalleled, an intentional choice that reflected Amara's influence and their shared commitment to inclusivity. Richard glanced at Amara, who stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the runway. She radiated quiet confidence, and for a moment he felt a pang of gratitude that she had come into his world. She had challenged him, pushed him, and ultimately made him better, not just as a designer, but as a leader. When the final model walked, the crowd erupted in applause. The energy in the room was electric, and as Richard and Amara stepped onto the runway together, the standing ovation was deafening. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment, and the media rushed to document the historic partnership that had redefined the fashion landscape. After the show, as the guests mingled and celebrated, Richard found himself in a quiet corner, reflecting on how far they had come. Amara approached him, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "For the toast you never made," she said, handing him one. He smiled, taking the glass. "I didn't think I'd ever be toasting to someone else's ideas," he admitted. "But here we are." Amara raised her glass, her smile warm. "Not just mine. Ours." They clinked glasses, the sound crisp against the buzz of celebration around them. Richard looked out at the room, filled with people inspired by their work, and felt something he hadn't expected: peace. He had spent so long fighting to protect his legacy, only to realize that sharing it had made it stronger. As the night wore on, Amara and Richard stood together, discussing plans for the next collection, the next vision, the next chapter. The brand had become a movement, a beacon of what the fashion world could aspire to. And, for the first time, Richard didn't feel like he was losing anything. He was gaining everything. The lights of the city outside sparkled like a promise, and the two of them, side by side, stepped into a future that was theirs to create, together. The story teaches us that arrogance and prejudice can blind us to the true value of others, but humility and openness can lead to growth and transformation. Success is not just about individual talent. It's about collaboration, inclusion, and the courage to adapt to change. Recognizing and respecting the contributions of others not only strengthens relationships, but also creates opportunities for innovation and progress. In a world that is constantly evolving, those who embrace diversity and shared vision will thrive, while those who cling to ego risk being left behind.